In this video, we're going to build a mastering chain for a track that is ready to have those processes applied to it. I think before we go any further, we should just hear it so we can see what we're dealing with. Okay, so it's a simple track, but it contains some crucial information, and we're just going to sort of talk about that before we start thinking about mastering, because actually our analysis of the track and thinking about it is going to help feed into the processes that we then choose to apply. So obviously there's a pretty strong bottom end. There are then lots of little sort of 16th sequences that are all sort of focused around the sort of mid-range, and then in the second half of the track we get this offbeat hi-hat, which obviously is lighting up the top end. So effectively, from bottom to top, we've got different things happening in different frequency groups, and of course, this being a music track, the elements of those obviously aren't delineated in just those areas. Obviously, some of that sort of driving content from the bottom end is into the mid-range and vice versa. So things overlap. We haven't got complete definition or total separation, but what we have got is those sort of three areas doing those things, and I think thinking about it and analysing the track that way is going to be useful. Before we start throwing plugins at it and thinking about how we might go about the mastering process, it's also worth noting two other things. You'll see here that I brought a mix file into a brand new arrangement. It's always a good idea to separate mixing from mastering, so this is a mix file without any processing on it up to this point. The other thing to note is its volume. We've just listened through it, and so as a result we can see that it's peaking at sort of -2 dB. When you're making mix files, if you can aim to leave a little bit of headroom at the same time as not running mixes off so quietly that you're actually losing resolution, and that's perfect, and sort of -3, -2, somewhere in there is about right. The other thing you can see that I've done is to actually leave a completely clear bar at the beginning. Occasionally when you press play on a render, you get tiny little artifacts or little clicks or little pops or even little tiny bits of reverb hanging over. So it's a good idea to actually leave some space at the beginning. It's very easy to get rid of that, so we'll do that in due course. And also to make sure that you also don't cut the end off. It's very easy to render to the last moment of actual program material in your mix rather than a couple of bars later. Again, give those reverbs a chance to die. Okay. So we obviously can apply effects processing either on the track directly or on the output channel. It won't make any difference because obviously eventually the sound is passing through either way. So the first plugin I'm actually going to bring in is FabFilter's Pro Q3. This is a sort of an EQ ready to sort of go to work on changing tone for us. However, I'm putting this in first, but I'm not going to touch it. And the reason for that is because if things needed addressing from a tonal point of view right now, I'd be better fixing those things in the mix. If the first thing you need to do is to start changing tone, then maybe that tells you something about your mix file. So you might then be thinking, well, then why have an EQ first at all? And the reason for that is there are going to be subsequent processes that we're going to work through, and it's possible that as a result of applying compression or loudness maximizing or stereo imaging or some of the things we're going to look at, it becomes necessary to change the tone at the beginning of the track. We might not need it, but we might. So it's a good idea to have an EQ at the top of your chain, even though for now we don't need to do anything with it. So actually the first consideration I'm going to start thinking about is compression. And there are two ways of looking at compression. You can either work with stereo compression, where a single set of compressor settings are going to be applied from top to bottom of the mix, or you can work with multiband compression, which is what we're going to do here. Again, I'm going to use FabFilter, and this time I'm looking at the Pro MB. Now, what this allows me to do is to break the frequency spectrum down into a number of groups and then apply individual compression to each of those. And as we've already discussed, there is obviously a sort of separation a little bit in this track from the bottom to the mid-range to the treble, which is going to allow us to think about those sort of three areas as separate things. Now, the way that the Pro MB works is it allows me to set up a band and for me to then set the band boundaries, so the sort of bottom and top end of each individual band, and then to apply the sort of dynamics processing I want to them. So if I create a band here, sort of at the top end of bass, if you like, then firstly I can drag this around to decide whether or not I want this frequency group to cover all the way from the bottom up to this point, or around a much narrower range of frequencies. Then what I can do is to set the threshold point, so the point above which compression is going to be applied. I've then got a dynamics range control. How extremely do I want that to work? And if I want to, I can even work with expansion. So in other words, I can push frequency content up or analyze it sort of the other way around, work with an expander rather than a compressor. I've got attack and release times in order to determine how quickly and how the compressor responds to dynamic changes in that particular frequency range, and also how quickly it recovers from them from a release point of view as the program material falls back through the threshold as it drops in level. I've got an overall output control for, remember, just that band, and underneath I've got a ratio control. And those are the main settings that will affect the way that this behaves. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to put a loop around the track, and we're going to set up 2 or 3 bands focusing on different parts of the mix. And as we'll see, we'll be able to actually solo them so we can hear how they're working and tweak their settings before reintroducing the rest of the mix, so we can make sure that the changes that we're making in each frequency band are working nicely. Let's start around here and see where that takes us. Okay, so we've got some pretty subtle changes here, and yet you can hear the difference. As I sort of punch this in and out, you can just see that each of these frequency groups is just a little bit more dynamically under control. You can see I've gone for very fast attack and release times in this kind of energized area in the middle. I want this to feel quite compressed, albeit we're making some pretty subtle changes to the amount of volume reduction we're applying there, and an overall volume boost to make sure that we're not losing too much energy there with those compression sort of pull downs in volume is helping as well. So again, we're doing this very quickly, but you can begin to see the power of multiband compression, but you can also begin to see that actually only subtle changes are required. The next plugin we're going to look at is iZotope's Ozone 8, and this is a sort of one-stop shop for mastering. Amazingly powerful tools, and this plugin takes a sort of modular approach. So you can see that by default, when I just open the plugin, we've got an EQ, we've got dynamics processing, we've got a loudness maximizer, and there are other modules that we can add here as well. What I'm actually going to do is to strip all of this away all together, and the moment I do that, Ozone 8 asks me which modules I'm interested in, and we can begin to build a chain that we want. Now, I'm going to be a little bit deliberately limited here in my choices because I want to sort of spread the processing across a number of separate plugins. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at just a couple of things here. Firstly, we're going to look at stereo imaging. And what stereo imaging allows me to do, again, in a multi-band way, is to either make different areas of the frequency spectrum more monocompatible, so the stereo width in that frequency zone is reduced, or what I can do is to boost the sense of stereo in particular frequency areas just to give the mix a slightly more cinematic feel. Now we're going to do this super quickly. I'm going to sort of set a zone up to about 200 hertz or so, and we're actually going to make that channel a bit more mono-compatible by reducing stereo width. We're then going to set a sort of low mid-range kind of area into the mid-range, I guess, and we'll leave that one alone for now, or just a tiny little boost there. Then what I'm going to do is to set a sort of upper mid-range into treble zone, and this we're going to boost a little bit more substantially. In fact, very substantially, so we can hear it clearly. And then what we'll also do is add some extra air to the top end as well. So let's be bold. We'll just mute that for a second altogether, bypass that effect, and then I'll punch it in halfway through. Okay, so you can hear really clearly how that's working, but to hear it even more clearly, let's just solo this band here, band 3, just so we can hear just this frequency area. We'll take this back down to 0 and we'll hear what happens as we increase stereo width. Okay, so you can hear really clearly how the kind of ambience, the sort of side channels almost of this sound just kind of get boosted in volume, and as a result we get this much more cinematic feel to the mix. Now be careful, because stereo widening is amazingly seductive, and if you apply it just across the entire mix you'll lose any sense of focus, you'll lose the kind of clarity and the purpose, and certainly the mono compatibility of your mix, so just be careful. And in general I would say, as a kind of rule of thumb, that it's definitely sort of upper frequency content, high mid-range and treble, where increasing width tends to sound good, and towards the bottom end you'll find that the opposite's true. So that's that. The other thing we're going to do is to look at equalization from a sort of second time. Now remember, the first equalizer we put in isn't actually doing anything yet. We're going to come back to that in a little while. But what Ozone's extremely good at is making sort of surgical EQ choices. And what I want to do is just to find a couple of frequency areas which I think are a little bit pokey, and make them very narrow, and just go after those, targeting some pretty surgical changes. Let's just have a listen and we'll see where we're talking about. Now, generally speaking, I would say that this track isn't offering anything too offensive from a frequency point of view, but you can see what I have a chance to do is to find individual frequencies that are maybe a little bit pokey, make them as narrow as I sort of want, and then having done that, make sort of gain adjustments just by pulling these down. And generally speaking, I would say that if you're making surgically EQ choices, it's a much better idea to identify those frequencies, turn them up so you can hear them even more clearly, and really check that the frequency that you're adjusting is the one that you want to kind of attack. And having found it, then cut its frequency with the gain dial, so that you're actually making the choices that you're going after, and you've got a very clear sense of what those frequencies are. Okay, one more plugin to add, which is going to be the Sonox limiter. And what I'm going to do here is to just explain a little bit about how this plugin works and what it does. So there are effectively two ways of measuring volume. There's peak level and there's average level. Peak level is the loudest thing that happens, but generally speaking, our ear is drawn much more to average level, the sort of perception, how it feels to listen to the volume of a track. And another way of thinking about that is almost to sort of look at a waveform and understand it on that level. You can see that I've got loud moments, and then between those loud moments, I've got quieter moments. It's a pretty crude way of thinking about it, but it's kind of useful. Imagine if I could broadly preserve the volume of the loud bits, but bring up the volume of the quiet bits so that on average, the track was louder between these peaks. Well, as I say, it's a slightly crude way of thinking about it, but that's kind of what loudness maximizers do. They allow you to turn volume up, set a ceiling for how loud that sound can get, and as a result, for instance, if you have a track that's peaking at minus 2 dB, the loudest bits can only get turned up by 2 dB before they reach maximum, but the quieter bits in between can cope with much more volume increase, and the more you turn them up, of course, the louder the average volume feels. So what I'm going to do first of all is to set what's called an output ceiling. I'm going to just make sure my mix doesn't exceed the level that I set here, and I'm going to set that just below 0. And then what I can do is to use the input gain to decide how much volume I want to add. Remember, our sort of peak level of the unprocessed file was at minus 2 dB. So if I turn this up by 5 dB, then of course those moments are only going to get boosted a little bit, whereas the bits in between, the average level of the quieter moments, can come up that much more. I can use this thing here called safe mode, which basically ensures that any sample moments which are threatening distortion are caught and captured and dealt with quite carefully. So let's just have a listen without worrying at the moment about attack and release times, just to see what we can do with the Oxford limiter from a volume point of view. This is going to be louder. So you can also hear the effect of attack and release, and particularly sort of at the bottom end there, as the release time changes, you can hear how it sort of thumps almost a little bit more at sort of almost the sort of release time, or the decay time of the kick drum sort of seems to hang around in a way at shorter release times, and with longer release times it just decays a little bit more naturally. So with output limiting, what you're looking to do is first of all obviously ensure that you're not exceeding the output level, and most limiters won't let you do that, and then you have a chance to decide how much level you want to drive into the limiter in order to produce the output level you like. And of course, we could have an endless discussion about the loudness wars and preserving volume. Don't go crazy here. So at this moment, what we're going to do is just to return to our EQ at the beginning. We've added some processes now, which gives us a chance now to think at the last stage about whether or not there is a frequency group that we want to either cut or boost in a sort of broad brushstroke way. And of course, the effect here will then pass down through all the other processes we have running subsequently, which hopefully will sound more natural. Also, it's a really good idea to think that if this EQ is at the end, and if I now made a boost somewhere, then of course it would tip the volume over into distortion, because the output limiter is effectively capping the ceiling of the mix very close to 0, in fact at 0. So if I suddenly find a frequency and boost it at this stage, it's highly likely that of course we're going to tip over into distortion. So it's a good idea to make sure that the limiter is the last thing in your chain, and we're going to go back and do a little EQ tweak at the beginning. I want a little bit more top end, I think, and I'm going to just apply this as a kind of high shelf filter. Again, not going crazy, but now that we've added a little bit more weight to the kick, I want to feel that hi-hat a little bit more. Okay, that's working well. Okay, so we've just added a little bit of change, and you can see obviously we haven't sort of had an effect on that tipping, that volume boost tipping over the limiter, because it's right at the beginning of the chain rather than at the end. So what I'm now in a position to do is just tidy this file up. I obviously don't want a whole bar of silence at the beginning before I render out my master. So what I'm going to do is just adjust the left-hand edge, leave a tiny bit of silence so that I don't clip off the beginning of that waveform. And then what I can do is move the file back to the beginning of my project. And what I could also do would be, if I wanted to think about sort of applying a fade at the end, just so I'm sort of capturing that file and just managing its volume, and I could think about curves and all that kind of stuff. Again, listening is the best way to go. And then obviously I can just print this mix when I'm ready. But before we wrap up, the first thing to say is that every single track is different, and the purpose of mastering for every single track is different. So any sense that there's a sort of preset chain of effects that you should use every single time is completely erroneous. What works well for one master is going to be completely different from another. So if you're mastering your own material, try really hard to make sure that you're really asking questions of it every time you start a new track. What do I want this master to do? What's its purpose, and where is it going? And make your tone and dynamics changes and stereo width changes based on the answers to those questions.